we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Welcome to Energy Impact. I am so excited today to have with us Zainab Gilani. She's a research associate at the Cleantech Group covering energy and power. It's really exciting to have you here, Zainab. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michelle. Thanks for having me. It's also great seeing you not that long ago. I know we connected maybe a few weeks ago at the Cleantech Forum in San Diego.
Yes, it was lovely to meet you, and a really, really awesome event. We'll definitely get into some of the programming that Cleantech Group covers, but I'd love to maybe first just start out getting to know you. Can you tell me, a little bit about your background, where you're from?
Yeah, of course. So I'm currently in New York right now, and I've pretty much spent my entire life in New York. I did like a brief 6-month stint studying abroad at the University of Edinburgh while in college, but yeah, pretty much born here, grew up here, went to school in like upstate New York for college. Came back here and worked pretty much remotely for a lot of it because like after COVID we were remote for a bit. So yeah, that was all like really interesting. But yeah, I was fortunate enough to like have some time to like travel in between that. But yeah, I did my background like education wise is in physics and English. So I know that's like a pretty weird, interesting combo, but I feel like it really helps me with my work in market research. Yeah.
Yeah. So what drew you to physics? What drew you to English? And how did you kind of see yourself taking those two interests forward into your career?
Yeah, so it's so crazy because I started college with literally no idea what I wanted to do. And I pretty much like almost graduated college with that same mindset. I just like took whichever classes I really enjoyed. And I think both physics and English is like a lot of problem solving. So I know people talk about first principles thinking a lot these days, but for me, like when you're just kind of like starting off with a physics problem, it's so interesting to like really understand like what the givens are, what the unknowns are, like what the variables are, and how you can kind of play around with those. And I feel like that thinking has also like helped me a lot in the work I do now. But yeah, I pretty much just took whatever classes I was interested in. So I was at the University of Edinburgh. I was like able to take really cool classes like high energy astrophysics, physics of climate. And then in like English classes, I was able to like mystery of horror, and then just like I really appreciated the whole like storytelling element.
Left brain, right brain.
Yeah, exactly. It was really cool. But yeah, like when it comes to sustainability, like it was always something I like cared a lot about and I was super passionate about. Like I would see waste in like all these different areas. Like when I would go back home to visit my family in India, you can kind of like very visibly see the waste issue. So I always kind of thought my career would take me more down the circular economy path, which it did for a little bit, but I was able to kind of like transition back into energy and power and really use some of my like physics knowledge.
Wow, that's awesome. So energy and power, what kind of started you down that path of being interested in that specifically? Especially in Edinburgh too. It's like a really beautiful space where you're studying, and there's nuclear power plants around, but really you're just kind of in great countryside. So yeah.
Oh, I had like the time of my life there. It's like my favorite physicist was like James Clerk Maxwell, and he studied at Edinburgh. And then like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, like his like Sherlock Holmes, like it's a very like educational atmosphere too, which was really great. But it's funny that experience was also really interesting because I volunteered with an organization that was focused on sustainability. So they were actually doing solar power panel installations in refugee camps in Greece. And so I was like very much more like an ancillary, just like supporting when I can with some of the admin stuff. But like just seeing the work that they did was super interesting. So yeah, trying to get more involved with like, that kind of thinking. But like career-wise, I ended up working for a company called TerraCycle for a little bit, and then an impact investment firm where I like focused more on circular economy issues.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like funny because it eventually helped me to transition into energy and power because I had this whole mindset that I needed to like work at a nonprofit and I had to like work on waste issues. But then through my experiences, I kind of realized that like for profit and working with like entities on a larger scale, you can really tackle the energy issues at like a broader angle.
That's a really powerful insight. It's one that I've also had in my career as well. The impact that you can make kind of when you're on that private sector side, when you have kind of, the tools to do what you want in terms of, chasing what might be the most impactful for decarbonization, for sustainability goals. I think that there's so much power there. Are there any kind of key lessons that you learned as you were looking at this one career that could have been, but you found yourself moving more towards that impact investment space?
Yeah. So like, I think one clear takeaway is like, I think the most impactful organizations are financially sustainable organizations, because I was working for a nonprofit, like with TerraCycle. We essentially were trying to like help waste pickers pick up waste and marine debris from, the waterways in Thailand. And the team's doing great right now. Like, I think they've collected over 2 million pounds of debris. But I remember like around COVID time, like I was doing some of the budgeting and I was like, oh, it's going to be really hard to fundraise like in the US. And it's just like the timing for fundraising for a nonprofit during COVID, when people were a little bit, holding things a little bit closer to the chest. It made me realize that like, oh, I want to work for an organization that doesn't really have to like rely on outside sources of funding. And I think that was a clear aha moment where I was like, oh, maybe like impact focused like businesses is where I want to be. So like that kind of like was a major transition for me.
Okay, so what started you down the path where you ended up eventually going into the Cleantech Group? Obviously, there's it seems like from your educational background, there's a keen interest that you have in research, in kind of like asking why and being exposed. It also seems in your early career to the impact makers, the innovators. So yeah, how did you get pulled into Cleantech?
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting because I started Cleantech Group thinking I would be focusing on the circular economy sector. So we have 5 main sectors. We have materials and chemicals, resources and environment, transportation and logistics, ag and food, and energy and power. So I thought I was going to be a little bit more on the circular economy side, but I got a little bit more exposed to the work that we were doing in energy. And my other like aha moment was like, if you can just like switch where people get their electrons from, no one really cares. Versus like if you're working in circular economy, you don't want to give them like a paper straw because it like ruins the customer experience, or like you don't want to like force people to like use, certain models that, may not be like organic for them. Like the whole consumer behavior and like asking people to sacrifice. It's not the whole part of circular economy, but it's a part that I found was like really difficult to like try and move forward. Versus like with renewable power and energy, I'm just like, if you can have, industries and people have this like operate the same exact way, but just convert to renewable power and give them the storage or the solutions they need on the back end, like people won't care. And I think that was really enticing to me.
That's another really, really important insight. I'd love to unpack that a little bit more. I mean, just the foundational role that energy plays, not just in your daily life, but in literally everything. From, as you said, the products that you consume, like straws or packaging, to the transportation sector, to the fact that we're recording this podcast right now and I have lights all around me, which is how people really think about electricity. But it's so foundational that it also, impacts our quality of life. It impacts, the abilities that the opportunities that we have to, to do things that are maybe not in the clean tech space, but to dance and to sing and to travel and to really just enjoy life. How have you kind of seen that manifest since you had that realization and now are fully in the power and energy space?
Yeah, no, it's so crazy to think because it's like the demand for consumer goods and the demand for energy is only going to increase, right? And at least when you're working on the energy side, you can be like, okay, if we can find like a drop-in substitute for where people are getting their energy, whether that be like nuclear power, like SMRs, like normal nuclear, large scale plants, potentially fusion down the line, wave energy converters, there's all these different like innovative technologies that we're looking at for like different applications. And I think like really understanding like where the production matches the application is really crucial. And I know you do that with your work at Lost Energy, but I think, understanding the different types of energy that can be provided for different circumstances and like having people maintain the same quality of like life output, like, especially when you're working for industries, you can't really have, power generation at 99%. Like you can't really afford to have, a manufacturing facility be out of power for like a day while you're trying to like figure it out. So yeah, I think like that key component of like really trying to figure out where the best solutions are for each application has been really interesting.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So let's turn to your current work and um, maybe let's kind of discuss some of the recurring themes that you found as you've been exploring these various industries. What are the kind of key investment trends? What have you seen really driving each industry that you've studied?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. Trying to think if I should just like do it for each sector. But like obviously the key drivers throughout are just lower cost. Like lower costs are absolutely key, especially when you're looking at like the levelized cost of electricity or versus the levelized cost of storage for potentially long duration energy storage technologies. Everyone wants the lowest cost solution that's the most reliable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's also where a lot of things like nuclear can come in because you have like really high capacity factors and it's like well-established technologies. But the biggest problems right now are the known cost overruns, the really long timelines, and then potentially if you're looking at new nuclear, how those supply chain challenges can be for those like different fuels. So I think supply chain challenges is also a really interesting kind of challenge because I'm
Yeah.
sure like 3-4 years ago people didn't really think that there would be as many challenges sourcing supplies, especially with what's going on in like Russia and the Ukraine. I know there's like a whole issue with the HALEU supply now because a lot of it was tied up in Russia, so that's causing a bit of problems for a few companies in the new nuclear sector. But across the board, I think making sure that the bill of materials for companies who are doing new technologies, we can really like understand the cost because I imagine it's really hard for investors to look at a new technology and be like, okay, these are kind of the costs now, but how are they going to go down over time, and what are the assumptions that are being made about like how this material will cost 5, 10, 15 years. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think supply chain has definitely been one of those big challenges
Yeah.
for a lot of
Definitely.
industries.
And it's not just in nuclear, it's a great example you brought up with nuclear fuel, but even, as we see in the semiconductor space, it's just really a lot of these energy technologies that have kind of these cutting edge materials. We have to ensure that we have that security of supply, and that's when these geopolitics kind of come into play as well.
Yeah, yeah. And then another one maybe I didn't mention is just like I think for new technologies, just like investors trying to take on technical risk.
Mm.
So I think what's really interesting is when you look at maybe the long duration energy storage, you have these types of technologies like thermal battery storage or like thermal energy storage, and then more electrochemical storage. So with thermal energy storage, you're kind of working with known materials like Antora. They just raised $150 million in their Series B, which is great. But they're working with like solid carbon and graphite blocks. So it's not necessarily like something that's so new that people are going to be like, oh, investors are taking on quite a large amount of technical risk. Versus like I think when we were looking at the electrochemical battery space, we saw a lot of investments going into Form Energy. Form Energy raised like $600 million, I think, since 2021, and also like investments going into really new types of like chemistry. So there's chemistries that use nickel, zinc, all types of different flow battery solutions. And, they do have their investors, but I think when we speak to other investors who maybe didn't invest in that sector, they were a little bit more hesitant to take on investments in a solution where, they weren't fully sure how it would play out in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some of the other kind of key considerations that you've seen by the investment community as they've been looking at new energy technologies overall?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because, like, fortunately at Cleantech Group, a wide variety of our clients are like in the financial services field. So, they include private equity, venture capital, banks, and insurance agencies. And we talk to a lot of them as we do our research as well. So I love talking to people from Europe because they're very honest. They'll be like, yeah, I think a lot of the American companies are really overvalued.
Mm.
And like they'll be like, yeah, maybe the market timing isn't great. So I think just like how people approach their investment strategies is really interesting. And then when I talk to American investors, like they're so excited about their investments. It's like really great to talk to them because they'll go really deep into the technical details of why they've invested in certain technologies. And yeah, it's really clear just like what kind of like went into their thinking and why they invested. So yeah, it's definitely like I think electrochemical long duration batteries are a really interesting space to be looking at. Not sure 100% how it's going to play out with like some of the other long duration energy storage technologies because you also have mechanical solutions like Energy Vault, people know pretty well, QuidNet, HydroStore, and also thermal, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, So what are some of the other kind of key learnings that you've had, maybe as you've been looking less speaking with the investment community, but as you've been speaking with the innovators in this space? What have the themes been there?
Yeah, so it's so broad because we speak to like so many different innovators across different sectors, but maybe one I'll touch upon that maybe you don't get too often is fusion.
Mhm.
So I am so excited about fusion. I know it's one of those things people always say it's, 30 years away, and a lot of fusion companies have made very, very ambitious goals. Some of them have said that they're going to try to achieve break even in 24 and 2025, and break even is essentially when the fusion reactor is able to output more energy than its input. And it's a huge milestone. It's one of those things that the National Ignition Facility was able to achieve not too long ago, and it made headlines. So that was a really exciting moment. But I'm really excited to see which private company does it first.
Yeah. So I'm curious in that space, right? When you look at some of the really large internationally funded projects like CERN, and then you see some of these private innovators
Yeah.
trying to do that, how from the kind of the objective research angle, and then also understanding how investors are looking at the space, how do people kind of think about the differences in the level of investment from these large scale projects to these, single company innovations?
Yeah, so it's a really, really good point. I think the consensus is that private companies can move way faster than these international organizations like ITER and some of these other players, where they're doing really, really great work. Like a lot of the main scientists from the private industries have come out of those organizations. They do a lot of research that's really relevant, but in terms of like actual, moving towards a goal of like commercialization, private companies like by far are doing so well. And I think what's really, really helpful has been the advancements in computer science, AI, and machine learning. Overall, I think just like the quality of the simulations that these private companies are able to do, just like really, really accelerate the simulation and testing process.
Mm.
So it's a lot easier for investors to like have clear milestones and to like understand the simulations and then where the companies actually are with their physical experiments. It also saves these companies a lot on cost, because if you're able to have really high quality, real-time simulations that are fairly accurate, you don't have to use expensive supplies, fuels to do a lot of the physical experiments. You can go into the physical experiments knowing a lot more than you may have done beforehand. So yeah, in terms of your point on like how do investors invest, I can't get too into like every single company and why each investor invested in which technology type, but I think what's really exciting is you have companies like Helion and CFS achieve certain milestones. So with the Commonwealth Fusion based out of Boston, they were able to work with MIT on high temperature superconducting magnets. And the specific milestone they were able to reach allowed them to have like almost a $2 billion like Series B investment. And I think Helion as well, they were able to achieve temperatures of around like 100 million degrees Celsius. And so that also encouraged investors to invest. And those are the big name players. But I think what's really interesting about the research that we do at Cleantech is we see, your trends in 2021 and 2022, massive, $2 billion, $3 billion like years. And then you see 2023 and it's like so much less. And you're like, oh, people aren't interested in fusion anymore. But that's not the case. It's like the number of deals actually increased. They were just smaller volume deals going into newer technologies. So I thought that was really interesting, like people investing in seed stage fusion. I'm not saying they're betting against the big companies, but I'm saying they're still interested in the fusion industry, but maybe not the most typical technologies like, you have your common tokamaks or your, field reverse configuration devices that people have been investing in. And like, I can talk about fusion for a while. And like the guys that we had at our forum in San Diego were great. Like if you go into their technology, it's so interesting. I don't know how technical you want me to get right now, but
I mean, well, actually, so you did write a few recent posts, and then of course we had the session in San Diego. But I think you had 3 blogs over the past year around fusion. Yeah, pick the topic. I think you talked about commercialization, right, which we kind of looked at a little bit here. Specific systems you covered, and then of course the regulatory and supply chain kind of process that's being kind of developed for these new technologies, right, that are kind of a little bit different from the traditional fission ways that there are supply chain issues and regulatory issues. So I'd love to hear more of your perspectives on it.
Yeah, so I think I just kind of like always end up gravitating towards like what's really interesting to me. And I think in the fusion landscape, like just like generally what's really interesting to me are like the technologies that maybe don't use these super intense lasers or
Mm.
like these really high powered magnets. The technologies that we had at CFNA, they obviously are also complex systems, but I think generally speaking, to me, they seem a little bit more simpler.
Mm-hmm.
So we had General Fusion talk a little bit about their technology, and they're not necessarily your traditional tokamak or like laser-based inertial confinement system. They don't necessarily use those technologies, and they have like a kind of a mechanical system that allows them to get the fusion reactions they need. We also had MIFT and OpenStar technologies there. So OpenStar is really interesting. They're a company based out of New Zealand. Essentially, they use a levitated dipole system. And what a levitated dipole system essentially is it's almost like reverse tokamak, where you're trying to like you're trying to like have reach the same high temperatures and densities, but you can operate a little bit more efficiently. Like they can use their magnets more efficiently, and they also have the system that allows them to like take parts apart and kind of like put them back together again so that they can iterate really fast. And they're in their prototype stage now. And then MIFTY is another one we had speak. They essentially are doing Z-pinch, and Zap Energy is also doing Z-pinch. And I think these types of technologies are also really interesting for the same point where they're just able to test and move at a really, really fast pace. Um, MIFTY's been working really close with a few national organizations, and they're really transparent with some of the milestones that they've achieved in the past and that they're trying to achieve in the future. They're also one of those companies that has stated really ambitious goals of trying to achieve break even in the next year or so. So I'm just looking forward to like some of the news and milestones that they release.
Yeah. What is that? Talk to me a little bit about the full commercialization pathway with these novel fusion systems, right? So you've mentioned a few times this break even point as being
Mhm.
a really critical milestone. What are the kind of the next milestones in terms of actually reaching commercially viable fusion? And yeah, has your research shown that might be maybe it's still a stretch goal, but might we be looking at as potential futures where fusion is actually be able to be commercialized and more widespread?
Yeah, so you raise a really good point. Like just because the company achieves break even, it doesn't mean they're going to be commercialized the next day. Like commercialization is an entirely different topic where you have to like source all your materials, understand the supply chains. Like a lot of the key components are based out of like Japan and in other areas of the globe. So like understanding how you can work with like a really wide variety of players to get all the components and supplies and materials that you need to have an operating system, and not only just like one operating system, but to replicate that, that's not a small task. So just because a company achieves break even, it doesn't mean that we're gonna like have commercial fusion on the grid. I think most estimates will say like even in the fusion industry, a little bit more towards like the 2040 mark potentially of like actually seeing more than one reactor online and connected to the grid and like a wider capacity. But yeah, it's the same kind of problems as like a lot of the other industries are facing. It's like how do you get the costs down? Like you want it to be cost competitive. How do you make sure that you have like substantial supply chains that are reliable and are available? One of the components I was looking at is lithium 6, and I think there's like some trickiness there because it's not like necessarily a material or compound that's readily available in the United States. You have to
Mm.
look at like other countries across the globe, I think including like Russia and China, and the way that you enrich it is not necessarily the best when it comes to health or safety or just chemically. I think there's like a bit of mercury involved. So I think understanding like where the actual bottlenecks might be for other supplies like that, and how that pans out for the wider fusion industry, because there's so many different cogs and pieces that you have to look at. So it's not just achieving break even. It's like what's the whole system, like what are the like who's working on the supply chain, and like what are those key components that are really needed to drive commercialization.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think yeah, with nuclear fusion, nuclear fission, these technologies have a real major potential for, decarbonizing the grid in the near term, in the long term, with even smaller, SMRs, we're looking at decarbonizing, not just the grid, but at the company level or the town or the city municipal level. But you also did a lot of work in long duration battery storage, which kind of helps with this other piece of the puzzle, right? Not every country is interested in nuclear as a baseload source, right? We have a lot of renewable capacity, wind, solar, that, has challenges in terms of the when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, as every politician loves to say.
Yeah.
But this emerging field of long duration battery storage is seen as a really critical technology innovation to enable that greater penetration of renewable electricity to support to have more stable grids and not just at the grid scale, but at the distributed energy scale as well with some of the smaller technologies. Can you talk to me about some of the trends that you've been seeing in that space?
Yeah. Oh, so interesting. So you said it pretty much exactly right. Right. So it's like you have areas where the sun isn't shining all the time, the wind isn't blowing. So how do you store that energy for use at a later time? And I think the best way to kind of talk about it is like the Department of Energy defines long duration energy storage as storage that can provide as backup for renewable generation for over 10 hours. And it's that 10-hour mark that's kind of key, because lithium ions do a great job up until like 4 hours, and then they start to get a little bit more expensive. I think one of the other challenges is just like overall with like safety when it comes to lithium ion batteries. Like when you have to like keep on stacking them on top of each other, it just like creates more of a fire hazard. And there have been a number of issues with lithium ion battery fires, especially in the state of New York. So just like understanding like what the limitations of lithium ion batteries are, because I mean, lithium ion batteries are a great product. Like they're super cheap, they're commercial. It's like, it would be great if we could just use lithium ions the whole way, but we can't really do that. And I think one of the problems is like lithium ion batteries, as they kind of scale, like their costs just go up proportionally. And then you have like these other types of technologies like flow batteries, where you can have a lot of the infrastructure already in place, and then the cost can scale maybe not as quickly as lithium ion batteries, because you just have to like increase the electrolyte and flow battery systems, and it's a little bit cheaper potentially down the road for those like longer energy duration storages when you get to 10 and 12. But yeah, it's a really interesting market, because there hasn't been like one solution that's been fully commercialized for everyone. But yeah, let me think about like what else I can talk about with like that market, because I think one of the interesting things how I approach the sector is because there's like vanadium flow batteries that already exist, right? So those are already commercial, but a lot of people don't think that they're going to really capture the market because they're really expensive. They're up to maybe like 2 to 3 times more expensive than lithium ion batteries. But I thought that was really interesting because you already have a product on the market. It's just like, is it possible to get those costs down? And I think one of the problems with vanadium flow batteries is just still the really, really volatile nature of the electrolyte, which is vanadium. So you have, again, like supply chain, where it's like a lot of the vanadium is wrapped up in Russia and China. And in China, it's really interesting because they have like almost an insular market where the demand for vanadium like meets the supply. So vanadium can be like a byproduct of the steel industry. So they do a lot of steel manufacturing there. So the vanadium they can take internally and domestically and transfer it to vanadium flow batteries within China. So the one organization I talked to who's in this field, they basically said that China is going to be one of the leaders in vanadium flow batteries, and they already have one of the largest vanadium flow batteries connected to the grid. There's this one company called Dali and Ranka. They essentially are one of the biggest VRFB developers in China. They raised, I want to say, over $100 million last year, and they have 100 megawatt battery that's installed. And I think we're just going to be seeing more of that in China. So even though this may not be like the best solution for like every other country, like maybe not for California or for New York, but I think in China, it'll be really interesting to see how this market potentially grows internally there. But I think it's also interesting because Australia and the US and parts of the UK, they're also trialing vanadium flow batteries, and they're also looking to expand mines. But it's one of those things where there's still a lot of dependent variables on like how much the actual electrolyte is going to cost. And I think one thing that's really interesting with this type of battery is some companies are piloting a system called like electrolyte leasing. Okay. So a lot of flow batteries, the most expensive part is the electrolyte, and that's essentially what moves the charged particles across from the battery so that energy can be stored. So because vanadium does not degrade over time, you can essentially just like lease it out to people so that you just like loan it out to them, and then potentially if you need to like disassemble the battery, you can take it back. So if that works, I think that could be a really cool way of keeping costs low and not passing it on to the customer, but still keeping my eye out on how that works, because I don't think that's going to be like the solution that like fixes every problem.
No, but it's really fascinating, right? Because I think right now we've been having a conversation around the technological advances and thinking about innovation from the technology perspective. But what you highlighted there, whether it turns out to be viable or not, is some of these kind of more business model non-technical
Exactly.
innovations that actually when you're dealing with things like just cost and delivery, right? That's actually where you need to be innovating, is on the financing mechanisms or the go-to-market mechanisms, strategies, or the these unique leasing and supply chain issues.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really interesting. Are there any other kind of trends like that you've seen that kind of you didn't expect when you were just looking at these from the technology perspective?
No, I mean, I think like those business model innovations are like, to your point, really, really interesting. Maybe like in some other sectors, when my colleague and I are looking at like home decarbonization, we're just like that's a tricky one. We can get into that later, but it's just like, yeah, like how do you take established commercial technology and just make it cheaper so that, you're not taking on any technical risk.
Yeah. No, I think going back to your foundational point though around energy, it's all about how you make it cheaper, because energy is the foundation of pretty much all society. Then we want to increase that access as much as possible, and that means lowering the cost. Okay, so let's turn a little bit to the future. You mentioned some of the trends you've been seeing in 2021, 22, 23. It's 2024. I don't know what your research agenda looks like to be able to write these kind of these future posts, but yeah. So what are you kind of currently seeing in the market in 2024? What are your predictions as of early March 2024, for where should people be watching?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it earlier, but I think the whole thermal storage energy, I think that's going to be really interesting because they benefited a lot from the IRA, and I think just seeing how they're able to scale those technologies will be really exciting, especially if they're able to like do it domestically. I know there's been some like there's been a lot of focus on keeping things domestic, and I think if you're able to scale those technologies, that will be really exciting. And then also just like, yeah, trying to see how the US is able to like take the IRA and actually like implement it. Hopefully things stay the same way, whether there's an administration change or not, but obviously I can't predict the future on that. I know it's an election year for a lot of countries globally. And I mean, me personally, because maybe I live in like a US bubble, I just feel like it's going to be a really big one here. But yeah, I think just like keeping my eye out on just like how a lot of the investments that happened in 2021 and 22 play out, and see like the market consolidation across maybe a few key players. I think one of the biggest things will be like looking at the partnerships that organizations have taken on with either utilities or with private corporations. I know you're in the new nuclear sector, and I'm really keeping my eye out for additional announcements about like who gets licensed, what the regulatory process looks like, and maybe if there are any other companies that are working with key corporate players, just so that like, as I'm sure and maybe you want to talk about it a little bit, but just like matching up those new nuclear technologies with like really key applications, whether that's in industry or data centers, or like in regions that don't have access to renewables like wind and solar, like in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I think if you look at the outcome of COP from the nuclear perspective, for example, right, we had 30 plus nations signing on to triple the nuclear capacity by 2050. But really, what that was kind of a challenge to the industry. Like, okay, from the policy perspective, we recognize the value of this technology. We recognize the importance of nuclear or other technologies to addressing climate change, but a challenge to the industry to actually deliver on that. And I think that's exactly where we kind of agree. We're in that space where it's time to start delivering. It's time to start, those regulatory processes, figuring out those supply chain kinks, and ensuring that we're starting to get clean electrons on the grid, not just in the nuclear space, but across really all of these technologies that have benefited from, funding and attention, and I think a turning tied in terms of recognition of the value that we need to be making these investments. And that's not just from the policy perspective. It's also, as you said, from the corporate perspective, some of these partnerships that we're seeing. It used to be 5-10 years ago, you'd see a lot of, great statements by corporates about how they want, they have these goals to transition. But now that they're kind of coming at the end of those deadlines they've set for themselves, it's time to really see what progress can be made. And yeah, I'm also really excited to see how, both the innovators take on that challenge, but also how the larger corporates, work with those innovators to ensure that they can deploy those technology innovations and see real impact and see real progress.
Yeah, you make a really good point there. And I think there's almost like this kind of like chain reaction of like you have, the ball rolling and just like trying to see like where the momentum takes you. I'm really curious to see how that affects people on like an individual level, like the increased adoption in EVs, the increased adoption, like people just like trying to decarbonize their homes and taking on like individual actions. I think a lot of times in Cleantech Group, it's easy to talk about industry because you're working with fewer players. It's hard to talk about like 300 million people in America and trying to like get everyone to adopt new practices or take on new technologies in their homes to decarbonize. And I think that kind of like ties into the research that me and my colleague Selena Law, she's the other she's the other lead for the energy and power sector at Cleantech Group. But yeah, she's been doing a lot of work on just like decarbonized homes. And the key thing that we keep on coming back to is just like, you don't want to sacrifice your comfort. So whether you're installing heat pumps or a smart thermostat or like EV charging home batteries or solar, you want it to have a really seamless process. You want it to be low cost, and you also don't want to give the company negative reviews. And I think that goes a long way for these like technologies and companies that are selling to homeowners, because a lot of the way that they get business is by word of mouth. And if anyone does not have a good experience, like that is really detrimental. So just like understanding how these companies can work with homeowners to give them the best quality products and drive a lot of momentum just because they offer like really amazing savings on energy bills. They have like a really good app, or they just like provide a lot of value to the customer.
No, that's actually really interesting. To be honest, the term decarbonizing homes, it's pretty new. It's new to me. I've never really heard it framed like that. Yeah, I mean, obviously it makes a lot of sense, right? As we're looking at our own individual footprints, we kind of expand that to our households, and then, the physical spaces that we occupy and that we have control over. I used to think of it in terms of like, hey, we can weatherize certain things. We can, can ensure that we're making the right choices when it comes to utility, our utility bills, or if we're going to go off grid, what that might look like, or water, using less water and consumption and stuff like that. But the idea that that this is now a titled, a named idea is like really exciting. Can you tell me a little bit more about like, what all does that include? And what types of companies are leading in the decarbonized home space?
Yeah, so I mean, the way we think about it is just like if you're trying to take a home and decarbonize it, you have to decarbonize a lot of different aspects of it. And I think the biggest energy and electricity usage is on HVAC. So a lot of companies are trying to tackle that through heat pumps. You have like air source heat pumps that take air and transfer it internally and can heat and cool the house. That way you have like geothermal heat pumps that take heat and energy from the earth and can decarbonize homes that way. And then there's like air to water as well. But I think understanding HVAC is a really interesting problem, and you can tackle that a lot of ways. A company that I thought was really interesting is a company called Tato. They were on our GCT 100 report, and I spoke to them not too long ago, but they essentially are a smart thermostat. And pretty much like I said before, they say that they can reduce clients' energy bills by up to 22%, and they have almost like 4 million people onboarded in Europe. And I think just the really high cost of energy in Europe is one of the things that really drew people to Tato. And they're not only doing the smart thermostat, but they're also looking to make intelligent EV charging and also intelligent heat pumps, so that they're not necessarily doing the actual hardware themselves for EV charging and heat pumps, but they're making them more connected so that individuals can sell energy back to the grid at optimal prices and, still save on cost too. So I think it's a lot. The big angle is having homeowners save on energy bills is a really key part, like that kind of decarbonized home strategy.
Yeah. No, that's super cool. I will definitely be following that space.
We'll keep you updated. We're still in the middle of our research, so like the
I'm looking
definitions
forward to
are a
seeing
little bit ambiguous.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's great. Yeah, so maybe kind of turning to Cleantech Group overall, just since kind of giving you the space on this platform, do you have any kind of like upcoming announcements or milestones that you'd like to share or have our listeners be aware of that from the work you guys are doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just like overall, we're a research-driven organization. We track those key main sectors that I mentioned to you earlier. We work with a really wide variety of clients, so universities, financial services, governments, like city and local. And in addition to the research and consulting and event services that we provide, I think a really good way to like look at the foundation of our research is to look at some of the reports that we do. So you're at, Cleantech Forum North America. The big theme was our GCT 100 and who was on, that 100 list. And I think a really key point to make is, we're not just like pulling these 100 companies out of the air. We're not doing it based out of revenue. We're doing it based off of the opinions of 85 experts that we have on our expert panel. And how this works is that we really pick people who have skin in the game. So whether those are investors or corporates, people who would actively be engaging with the companies on this list, we have them on our expert panel. And the way the nomination process works is that everyone at Cleantech Group, we can, nominate companies that we think are really exceptional based off our research. And the investors themselves can nominate companies as well. But a fun thing that I think is really important is that you can't invest like just only your portfolio companies. If you're an investor, you have to pick non-portfolio companies as well and like expand the kind of scope of the nominations that we have. So we have a really great pool of nominations, and then it's an iterative process where our experts vote on the top 100 companies. So yeah, like the way my team describes it is just like a really great chance to like look back at the industry and really see what everyone thinks is the most impactful technologies and where they think, these technologies might go in the next few years. So yeah, that's like one of the main reports that really sets the tone for the rest of the year. We also have follow-up reports like the APAC 25 and the Cleantech 50 to watch. And then we have our following events in Singapore in May, and then hopefully France in November as well. So a lot of it is just based off of the research reports that we provide.
Well, fantastic. Well, maybe I'll ask you kind of like one of the question I like to wrap some of these up with, which is just, tell me kind of from the personal perspective, or you can take it from the Cleantech Group's perspective, what are you kind of most looking forward to in the future of the power and energy space? What kind of just gets you excited?
I'm still waiting for that like private fusion company announcement. Like I think someone's going to do it sometime soon. I don't know when. I don't know like fully what the impact is going to mean. Maybe like tons of investors are going to invest in that one company or that technology type, but I think it's coming in the next 2 years, and I'm like not sure when or who, but I'm really excited about that because I think that's going to be the thing that like delivers the like wide capacity of fusion that we need on top of like new nuclear and like the host of like solar and wind. I think it's obviously going to be there's going to be so much energy demand that it's not just going to be one technology type.
No.
Oh, and another one is wave technology. I think they're an underrated technology sector. Motion Energy is doing a great job. Core Ocean was also on our GCT 100. And I think they tackle like the coast to coast stuff where you can have like energy taken from the marine environment on the coast where like a lot of the energy demand is anyways. So yeah, that's another one that I'm looking out for.
Amazing. Well, lots of really exciting innovations to keep everyone's eyes out for in the next year, in the next few years, maybe next decades. But, and Zainab, it's been really fantastic to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being on.
So much for having me.
Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men and for the progress of all people.